And this is the subject of AI weapons. And on the one hand, whether military organizations should be developing artificial intelligence for the purpose of weaponry, for the purpose of killing people or controlling populations, with of course the risk being Skynet, the risk being Terminator, or should there be a ban on killer robots? Should there be a moratorium on any correlation between artificial intelligence and death, or artificial intelligence and killing people? And that is one of the mantras of the campaign to ban killer robots, which, we'll come to in a bit. But, the idea of whether AI should be a weapon is a bit of a paradox, right? It's a bit of a Schrodinger's cat, which on the one hand, we all kind of agree we don't want to weaponize AI. We don't want to empower AI. But at the same time, there is that Machiavellian sense, as Sharita just posted in the chat, that maybe AI has already been weaponized. Maybe there are already AI weapons, and not only are they in the hands of governments, but they could be in the hands of anybody. That it's really difficult to not only restrict the use of AI in general, but to restrict the development of AI weapons. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a role for public policy, and that's not to say that there isn't a role for democratic governments to, come together and try to at least ban AI weapons the same way that they might futilely or at least attempt to ban nuclear weapons. And here at Metaviews, we did look at this issue back in July of this year, where we published an issue on the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. And this is a U.S. government body. It's arm's length from the U.S. government, but appointed by and funded by and serving the U.S. government. And the purpose really of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence is to legitimize, from both an industry perspective and a policy perspective, the United States development of AI weapons. Because, kind of to Sharita's point in the chat, I think everyone sort of accepts that AI is being weaponized, that AI is becoming a weapon. So it's not a question of whether the United States would be, developing an AI weapon, but how would the United States be developing an AI weapon? And would that AI weapon be legitimate? And legitimate both in the sense of international law, but also legitimate in the sense of the views of U.S. citizens and the views of citizens around the world who use U.S. technology. Because here again, we get into another paradox where increasingly we're critical of the way in which the U.S. government uses technology, especially the military. But conversely, we depend upon U.S. technology. We were just talking about Apple, a U.S. company, and Facebook, a U.S. company. And then there's Google and Amazon, other U.S. companies that provide infrastructure to the world. So there is a bit of concern around the way in which our personal information is used to train weapons that could be used by the U.S. government. And so that's why this week, once again, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence reconvened for a public event in which they talked about the potential development of AI weapons and ironically cited a moral imperative as to why they should be exploiting AI weapons, right? This is the idea as to why there is a moral need, as to why the U.S. can't sit on the sidelines, cannot become party to any government treaty, but instead themselves have to make sure that there's a certain liberty when it comes to developing AI weapons. Now, this is a pretty serious substantive issue that, should be subject to more popular debate. And that's part of why I think the commission engaged in this public debate and hoping that they would get some public engagement. There's a reasonable amount of Twitter traffic. I mean, Jonathan Geyer, who is a journalist with The Prospect, he pointed out that while Eric Schmidt chairs the defense board and that the commission guards against conflicts, when they're subject to freedom of information requests, a lot of it gets redacted. other than the fact that they're using Google email, Gmail, which of course Eric Schmidt has a bit of a conflict of interest on. But this is just trying to get a sense of what are the politics, or, what is agenda at work when it comes to this commission. And, Jonathan's not alone in assessing that, right? The fact that Eric Schmidt is playing a role in arguing that there should be this moral imperative is something that a lot of the news is catching. It's a way in which this story is being framed. Now, if we take a moment just to look at the National Security Commission's About page, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this might be a vehicle for Eric Schmidt's ongoing lobbying and political career. Both positioning himself as kind of a leader in the AI space, but also trying to tie his own personal authority with the institutional authority that the National Commission has. And, on the one hand, I think that the role that this commission plays is very valuable and essential in terms of helping the government, helping the military kind of think about responsible AI, think about the way in which this technology could be used effectively. But it still feels a little bit like a dog's breakfast. It still feels like something that's just sort of been thrown together to legitimize what the U.S. government or the U.S. military was going to do. And that's why, even though I'm always hesitant to give attention and legitimize these types of processes, I also think that it's relevant when they do public events to kind of dissect what they're talking about, to kind of look at what they're saying as a whole. So I do want to showcase some of the video or some of the material from the public event, but I noticed that they were tweeting. Unfortunately, they didn't use Twitter threads, which would be convenient to someone like myself wanting to share it with you. But I feel some of these tweets could be indicative of the future of AI weaponry and the types of things, at least in the rhetoric and narrative, we should be paying attention to. For example, the argument that U.S. government must field AI-enabled technologies to protect the nation. Probably a true statement, but also a very loaded statement. It's really important to emphasize that, at least for China, the entire country this is the evoking the China threat, that all of China is mobilized around building AI weaponry. So there's a new arms race that if we don't become part of, we've lost the battle already. And so it's interesting the types of cliches that they've chosen to tweet here. The importance of technology literate senior leaders. It's the idea that the commission needs to educate these people. We have to change the organization in order to change the outcomes. That's another kind of doublespeak for we need to adopt AI to make sure that, AI is part of how we choose who to kill and how we choose who to attack. It's moral imperative to pursue the hypothesis that AI will reduce collateral damage in war, which is another kind of interesting paradox, right? The idea that in making more precision weapons, that will reduce the civilian casualties in war and therefore encourage us to go to war because we'll only kill the bad guys. But of course, we all know from machine learning that such accuracy never exists, but that instead suggesting that there is that accuracy will encourage people to actually attack more. I mean, again, there's material here. You could go through these tweets, and just riff through the doublespeak forever. This commission has consistently said that the biggest issue is talent. Getting it, hiring it, promoting it, keeping it, getting the right people, getting them in the right place. I mean, 100%. And of course, that gets into the international nature of talent, and that visas against international students in the United States have dramatically hurt the U.S. AI industry while empowering their competitors, while empowering other nations who are much more open or much more willing to accept international students. I mean, again, there's quite a bit of material here in terms of what the National Security Commission looked at. I certainly encourage folks who are interested in doing a bit more of a deep dive on them to follow them on Twitter, as we have here at Metaviews, and give a perusal in terms of the type of stuff that they were talking about. As a terms of reference, here is the agenda that they had for their public plenary of the last 2 days. hopefully you can get a sense of how they phrased it up, right? With part one being defending America. So this is the kind of, priming the fear and getting everyone anxious about sort of the threats that are out there and the need to really supercharge the development of AI and AI weapons within the government and within the U.S. military. And of course, the devil's in the details, because the framing of a lot of this stuff is entirely relevant, right? It's, the irony here is that, the threats are real, but the responses only exacerbate the threats, right? It's like saying a hacker might get into your computer, so run this software that creates a backdoor that allows me to get into your computer to check to see if another hacker has used the backdoor that I've just used to get into your computer, right? At a point, there's a contradiction in this logic that has a lot to do with the way in which these threats are being framed. But similarly, here's the double-edged sword, in that the U.S. military and the U.S. government recognizes that they can't do this on their own, that they need industry. And that's kind of why Eric Schmidt is the charge of this commission rather than a 4-star general. Because the United States government needs to mobilize industry to build this weaponry, to build the artificial intelligence military complex, as it were. And I think that's why this commission is so interesting, because it'll give us an insight as to how that government money, how that military funding is going to flow into the technology industry in general. And I think that's where, there's a lot of opportunity for research, a lot of places to really look at the what this technology is, how it's being developed. Because while it is relatively secret, while it is being done as part of confidential supply chains, as we know from the SolarWind hacks, those supply chains themselves are vulnerable. And there are a lot of researchers who will comb through that stuff and really try to get a sense of what's happening out there, at least from a technology perspective, so that the policy can respond or at least inform what we should be thinking about and working about.